Welcome back to Energy Policy and Markets. I'm TJ Warren, CEO of Off-GridInnovations. Over the past year, the most consequential shift in clean energy hasn't been technology. It's been compliance, specifically IRS Notice 2026-15 and the Prohibited Foreign Entity restrictions tied to PAPR 45Y, 48E, and 45X credits. For us at Off-Grid Innovations, including projects like our 16 MW solar farm in Ventura, California, this hasn't been theoretical. We've invested millions into engineering, interconnection deposits, land control, environmental review, and procurement planning. As this guidance clarified, several projects entered a pause, not because they're unviable, but because capital requires certainty. Today, I'm joined again by David, a former IRS energy policy advisor, to break down what changed, why the market froze, how supply chains trigger disqualification, and the FEOC decision framework we now run on every project.
Thanks for having me back, TJ. It's important that we understand these changes deeply because they affect every stage of project development. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act inserted prohibited foreign entity restrictions into AU 77701 and tied them directly to credit eligibility, with Notice 2026-15 providing interim guidance. The key takeaway is if a project includes material assistance from a prohibited foreign entity, the credit isn't just reduced, it's disallowed outright.
That's a huge shift. What exactly qualifies as material assistance in this context?
Material assistance relates to the supply of manufactured products or components that come from prohibited foreign entities. This includes subcomponents even if final assembly happens domestically. So if your supply chain includes battery cells or critical minerals from a prohibited foreign entity, those costs count against your minimum applicable percentage ratio, or MACR.
Let's talk about the MACR calculation. How does that work in practice?
The MACR is calculated by subtracting direct costs attributable to prohibited foreign entity produced products from total direct costs, then dividing by total direct costs. If the resulting percentage falls below statutory thresholds tied to the construction start year, the project loses credit eligibility.
Sounds straightforward mathematically, but the challenge is tracing supply chains accurately.
Exactly. You have to identify which products are manufactured by foreign entities, understand ownership structures of those entities, and ensure accurate cost allocation.
For example, if a solar farm uses battery cells produced by a prohibited foreign entity, that impacts our MACR, right?
Absolutely. Even if final assembly is in the U.S., subcomponents from blocked entities count against you, and legally, if you know or have reason to know, you must treat those costs as disqualifying.
That adds significant buyer responsibility. At Off-Grid, we use a detailed decision framework to manage this risk.
Yes, and that framework starts by determining if the project claims credits under 448E, 45Y, or 45X, because these FEOC rules apply only then. Next is the ownership and control test. Any majority or operational control by a prohibited entity disallows credits. Minority passive investors are generally safe, but control rights are critical.
After ownership, how do you assess supply chain exposure?
We identify if major components such as solar modules, battery cells, inverters, or critical minerals are sourced from FEOC entities or their controlled supply chains. If yes, we calculate if their cost share exceeds thresholds that trigger disqualification.
And how does contract timing affect compliance?
Binding contracts signed before the effective date can provide a safe harbor, easing compliance burdens. Projects placed in service after the effective date must fully comply. Also, starting construction early doesn't excuse ownership violations.
That explains why some of our Ventura projects paused, not because they failed, but because financiers demand certainty with detailed MACR models and supply chain certifications.
Right. Debt and tax equity providers require rigorous due diligence, including supplier certifications and accurate MACR reporting.
What are the penalties if these rules are ignored?
There's a 1% understatement threshold triggering audits, penalties for inaccurate certifications, and a 6-year statute of limitations, making compliance essential.
This is heavyweight diligence, not just check-the-box compliance.
Exactly. This is serious industrial policy, not merely tax compliance.
Speaking of policy, how does this tie into broader U.S. industrial goals?
It incentivizes reshoring of manufacturing and diversifying supply chains away from geopolitical risks, giving domestic producers greater pricing power. This encourages transparency and supply chain integrity as permanent features of the market.
So this is about shaping the future of U.S. manufacturing, not just eligibility for tax credits.
Yes, very much so. It's about creating sustainable, resilient supply chains and fostering domestic industrial growth.
Looking ahead, do you expect more regulations like this?
I do. The trend towards supply chain oversight is here to stay, and disciplined operators who adapt will gain a competitive advantage.
As we close, David, what advice would you give developers navigating this new landscape?
Start conservative. Model. CR carefully, secure binding contracts early, and scrutinize your supply chain partners thoroughly. Better to pause and adapt than risk disqualification and costly penalties later.
Great advice. For our listeners, it's clear compliance is no longer optional. It's central to project viability. Thanks for joining us, David. This conversation has been incredibly illuminating.
Thanks, TJ. It's been a pleasure breaking down these critical issues with you.
And thank you all for listening. Remember, policy evolves, markets adjust, and strategy wins. Until next time on Energy Policy and Markets. Welcome to Energy Policy and Markets. I'm TJ Warren, CEO of Off-GridInnovations. Over the last year, the most consequential shift in clean energy hasn't been technology. It's been compliance. Specifically, IRS Notice 2026-15 and the implementation of Prohibited Foreign Entity, or FEOC, restrictions tied to Payoir FAPAR 45Y, 48E, and 45X credits. For us at Off-GridInnovations, including projects like our 16-megawatt solar farm in Ventura, California, this hasn't been theoretical. We've invested millions into engineering, interconnection deposits, land control, environmental review, and procurement planning. And as this guidance clarified, several projects entered a pause, not because they're unviable, but because capital requires certainty. Today, I want to break down what actually changed, why it froze parts of the market, how supply chains trigger disqualification, and the exact FEOC decision framework we now run on every project.
Let's start with what actually changed. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act inserted prohibited foreign entity restrictions directly into AU 7701 and tied them to credit eligibility, which was a major policy shift. Notice 2026-15 then provided interim guidance on defining what is a prohibited foreign entity, what counts as material assistance, how to calculate the MACR, and enforcement mechanisms. The crucial point is that if your project includes material assistance from a prohibited foreign entity, the credit is disallowed outright, not just reduced.
That's a significant change from previous practice. How does the MACR calculation work under these rules?
For FRE 48E investment tax credit and Puerto 45Y production tax credit projects, the MMACR is calculated as follows. MACR equals total direct costs minus direct costs attributable to PFE-produced manufactured products divided by total direct costs. If the resulting percentage falls below a statutory threshold based on the construction start year, the project loses credit eligibility. For 4-5X manufacturing credits, the calculation focuses on direct material costs rather than total direct costs.
So the formula is clear, but the challenge lies in tracing supply chains and defining what counts as manufactured products and direct costs.
Correct. Let me give you an example using a solar plus storage project like Rincon. Major components include PV modules, inverters, trackers, battery cells, battery management systems, and critical minerals. Even if final assembly happens in the US, if subcomponents come from a prohibited foreign entity, those direct costs count against your MACR. Importantly, if you know or have reason to know that a product was produced by a PFE, you must treat all direct costs for that product as PFE attributable.
That clearly shifts significant diligence risk to developers and buyers.
Exactly. That's why we developed a comprehensive FEOC decision framework, which we apply to all projects. This framework is what we present to lenders, tax equity investors, ITC buyers, EPC contractors, and procurement teams to ensure everyone understands the compliance status. Step 1 is determining if the project claims credits under Sheriff 48E, 45Y, or 45X, or ITC transfer under 6419. If yes, FEOC rules apply. Step 2 is the ownership and control test. Is the project owner directly or indirectly owned or controlled by a prohibited foreign entity? Majority ownership, board control, veto rights beyond protective rights, or operational control disallow credits. Minority passive investors are generally safe, but control rights are the critical factor. Step 3 is supply chain exposure. Do you use solar modules, battery cells, inverters, or critical minerals? If yes, trace whether any are manufactured by FEOC entities or controlled supply chains. Step 4 is the material assistance threshold. Calculate the percentage of total manufactured product cost attributable to FEOC sources. If above the threshold, credit is disallowed. Step 5 considers binding written contracts safe harbor. Were major components under binding contracts before the effective date? If yes, there may be transition relief. If not, full compliance is required. Step 6 is the timing test. Projects placed in service after the effective date must fully comply. Importantly, starting construction early does not excuse ownership violations.
That framework brings clarity to a complex set of rules and helps us categorize risk effectively.
Yes, projects fall into 4 risk buckets: green, low risk, no FEOC ownership, no PFE suppliers, clean sourcing; yellow, moderate risk, exposure below threshold with safe harbor contracts in place; orange, high risk, such as battery cells from majority FEOC manufacturers near threshold; red, disqualified, FEOC control or threshold exceeded.
That risk clarity is what capital markets demand, and it explains why some projects entered a pause. These pauses are not because projects are unviable, but because financiers require updated MACR models, supplier certifications, and revised EPC representations before committing funds.
Absolutely. The penalty framework is also stringent. A 1% understatement threshold triggers audits. There are penalties for inaccurate supplier certifications, and there is a 6-year statute of limitations on enforcement. This demands institutional-level diligence and a serious approach to compliance.
And beyond compliance, this represents a broader industrial policy shift.
Yes, combined with domestic content, bonus guidance, this policy incentivizes reshoring manufacturing, diversifying supply chains, and reducing reliance on geopolitical competitors. Domestic manufacturers gain pricing power, and supply chain transparency and integrity become permanent market features.
So the implications are profound. This is about shaping the future of U.S. manufacturing and clean energy markets alike.
Indeed. And looking forward, we expect more regulations focused on supply chain oversight, Disciplined operators who adapt early will gain significant competitive advantages in a market that increasingly values transparency and compliance.
As we wrap up, David, what final advice would you offer to project developers navigating this evolving landscape?
Start conservative, model your MACR carefully, secure binding contracts as early as possible, and scrutinize your supply chain partners thoroughly. It's better to pause and adapt now than to face disqualification and costly penalties later.
Thank you, David. This conversation has been incredibly illuminating and timely.
Thank you, TJ. It's been a pleasure to discuss these critical issues.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us. Remember, policy evolves, markets adjust, and strategy wins. Until next time on Energy Policy and Markets.